Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. Mesoamerica is one of the most widely misunderstood and wildly exciting areas within the entirety of the medieval time frame. So much about it is mythologized by pop culture and bad history alike, and partially because of that, I have been quite hesitant to really do a deep dive in the region, given I don't really trust my own ability to do it justice in research. However, that changes today. Because, with help from a very talented consultant, I can finally confidently answer the question, how much can we add to Mesoamerica in Age of Empires 2? There are a ton of fantastic options here, far more than I and maybe you could ever have anticipated getting out of this wonderful region, and it is all thanks to friend of the channel, longtime viewer, and fantastic consultant, AHMICQUI. He is exceptionally knowledgeable in all things Mesoamerica, and without him, this project could not have been possible. Please give him a huge thank you down in the comments section. With that, let's dive in to a little bit of a disclaimer. Who qualifies for this list? We are talking about civilizations in Mexico and Central America. We're not talking about South America, North America, or the Caribbean in this video. So we're talking about the normal AoE2 relevant time frame, 400 to 1600 AD. If a civ wasn't super relevant until after then, it probably won't be featured here. A lot of these could be counted as Aztec or Mayan splits, but plenty of these civilizations couldn't really be called either, hence why I really didn't want to call this a split video for the Aztecs or Mayans. I tried to divide umbrella civilizations where possible, namely a civilization that covers a lot of different territory, both temporally, politically, and regionally. Where I believe there is enough material to make multiple civilizations, I will almost always try to make it work. Though plenty of the civilizations here that could qualify as umbrellas also stand alone even if some of their subdivisions were to be added, in which case I would not want them to be removed. Of note, this list is not purely predictive, but it is ordered by rough likelihood. I would like to have almost all of these civilizations added, even if I only think maybe the top 4 or something have any chance whatsoever. So it's not realistic, but I don't care. It's important to highlight these civilizations nonetheless, and in my opinion, the more the merrier. If you want to support me and the work I do, please leave a comment. I want to hear what you have to say as always. Like and subscribe as per usual. If you have a couple bucks to spare, donate to me over on Ko-Fi and join the Discord, all of which can be found down in the description. And with that, let us move on to another brief disclaimer. What have we covered on the channel thus far when it comes to Mesoamerica? There are a couple of decent candidates. First of all, the Zapotecs. This is a very old build on my channel. You can check it out up here. I think it was the 11th build I ever did. And that shows. I've updated it a bit since then, and it is well due for a rework in my eyes. But just know, I think the Zapotecs are a very likely inclusion into the game. Frankly, it would be a travesty not to include them. Another example, the Mixtecs. The Mixtecs are one of the most recent Age of Empires 2 builds I have done on this channel, and in my opinion, they are also quite likely. Not to mention one of the most different and unusual civilizations that could possibly be added to the game. Lastly, the Purepecha, also known as the Tarascans, but Purepecha is a better name for them. I would call this the single most likely Mesoamerican representative to be added to the game. They are unbelievably interesting, incredibly prominent, and relevant for a big chunk of Mesoamerican history. Frankly, the game would be silly not to include them if/when we return to Mesoamerica. I also did a build on them back in the day. It's alright, but due for a rework as well. In addition to these civilizations, I've also added a couple of regional proposals, mostly to make it so that the Mesoamerican tech tree isn't so one note, shall we say, with overpowered bonuses compensating for massive gaps in their tech tree. I have the Jaguar Warrior proposed as a regional knight-like infantry, kind of like how the Eagle Warrior is scout cavalry-like. I have the Slinger, a new archery range unit, which ignores armor but does very little damage, and the Atlatl, which is a fast-moving ranged skirmishing unit with a slight bonus against cavalry. Kind of like a cavalry archer, kind of. I go into detail about all of these and their elite equivalents in my Mixtec build, so make sure you go check that out, link up here, if you want to see the details on how I would implement all of these units, plus the really fantastic Mixtec design that I came up with substantial input from my good friend and consultant, AHMICQUI. With all that, let us move on to the top contenders. Those last 3, by far and away, the most likely in my opinion, but besides them, there are 2 other civilizations I think are quite likely to be added, the first of which being the Toltecs. Who were the Toltecs? Well, they weren't real. Just to be simple about it, they are one of the most misunderstood elements of Mesoamerican history. You've probably heard the name. I sure as shit have known the name. But they were not a singular civilization or even an ethnic group. So who the hell were they? The name Toltec derives from the term Tolan or Tula. This is like a title given to the most important city in Mexico, the first of which was the great temple city of Teotihuacan, which you may have heard of. And so the Toltecs were the peoples of the Tolans, so to speak, the most important cities of early Mesoamerica. Why early? Because this term fell out of use by the post-classical era, which is like the 1000s to 1100s AD and beyond. But some city names like Cholula or Chololan actually retained the title because Chololan was relevant well into the pre-classical era when this term was in wide use, hence it being called Tolan Chololan. Now, kind of confusing, but just summarize the Toltecs, even though there's so much pop history nonsense behind them, as being a rough umbrella of pre-Aztec Nahua powers, especially Teotihuacan, which was extremely important. What would they play like? I think they'd be an early game powerhouse with a lot of different variety and options that could transition into like a mid-late game monk-focused civilization to represent the religious importance of Teotihuacan. You could even call the civilization the Tolan. Toltecs is just like way more recognizable, though it does have the downside of having a lot of myths and bad history associated with it. Either way, I think Toltecs does work. Note, this is definitely an umbrella, but I do think it's a necessary one. The civilizations it covers are all too minor and like individually unknown to work well, but together they fill an essential void of giving us some Mesoamerican stuff in the early side of the AoE2 relevant timeframe. Plus, this civilization could fill in for plenty of Nahua powers later on too if you wanted to get some civilization diversity in a scenario. Second top contender would be the Tlaxcaltecs. You've heard of Tlaxcala before, destroy the wicked Tlaxcala and all that. But who exactly were they? Well, they were a Nahua people, just like the Aztecs. In fact, they were Aztecs. They would have called themselves Aztecs. And so culturally and ethnically, they were pretty much identical to the Aztecs. But politically, they were bitter rivals and very, very different, especially in terms of how their histories panned out respectively. They went down very different paths, with the Tlaxcaltecs aligning themselves with the Spanish against their hated enemies, the Aztecs, and the rest, as they say, is history, as butchered in the Aztec campaign. So how would the Tlaxcaltecs play? I think they'd have to be a foil to the Aztecs, with a weakish early to mid-game, but a very strong and varied post-Imperial Age, featuring gunpowder and cavalry, given their close association with the Spanish. This civilization's placement on this list is down to two things. One, they're extremely prominent and iconic within the Aztec campaign, and also, two, it would be an extremely different playstyle to any other Mesoamerican civilization. Gunpowder and horses on a Mesociv. Oh, how cool is that? I think people would go nuts for it. And so because of that, even if I don't think this civ is as deserving as others down the list, I think it is actually extremely likely to be added. But I do still think, despite me thinking they might be a little overhyped by the greater community, they do still merit inclusion, even if I would personally have them further down the list. And this would let us get more like Aztec stuff in the game, because God, the Aztec civilization does such a terrible job depicting the beauty and variety and intrigue of their culture and military, and we could stick more of that here, which is great in my eyes. But with that, we move on to the high contenders, stuff that maybe could get into the game realistically, but would be a bit of a stretch, though it is all stuff that I would desperately like to see. First of all, the Yucatecs. This civilization would specifically be representing the League of Mayapan in the Yucatan Peninsula, which was a federation of Mayan city-states, including Chichen Itza, which was at its heyday from like the 11 to 1300s AD. This would be a subdivision of the existing Mayans, who could be renamed the Cholans and focus more on like the classical era Mayan heyday. Mayapan lasted well beyond the classical era collapse, and the League only dissolved in the 1400s, with the Spanish stomping out and conquering whatever remained of it. In terms of their playstyle, I think they would have to have like a defensive early game and an offensive mid to late game, with maybe a bigger focus on infantry to contrast the Cholans focusing on archers. You could also call this civilization the Mayapan if you wanted, though I think Yucatecs is probably a little more approachable. And the presence of both the Yucatecs and the Cholans as separate civilizations might be confusing. These two civilizations are very much separated by era, with like the classical era Mayans being relevant from like 700 to 1000-ish AD, and then the Yucatecs being really relevant from, like I said, the 11 to 1400s, that sort of thing. Next of our high contenders, the Otomi. This is a really fascinating civilization. They are a non-Nahua people, so they are not directly related to the Aztecs of central Mexico. They were present since the pre-classical era with Teotihuacan and all that, and likely even earlier. They were usually put on the back foot by their many Nahua neighbors, and they were like displaced and forced to move many times, but they were fearsome warriors, respected widely, used as mercenaries often, and played a major role in like the politics of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, often being pitted by one Nahua power against another. They had a pretty substantial range, with a lot of major like subgroups and subtribes, which gets very complicated if you try to dive into the details of it, and they both fought with and allied with the Spanish at various points during the conquest period. In terms of how they would play, I think they would have to have a pretty crap economy, maybe one of the worst in the game, but very strong elite units, especially infantry, maybe with like a good team bonus to show like how important they were to have as strategic allies. Of note, the name Otomi, as will become a running gag in this video, is a Nahua exonym. It was a Nahua word. Their own name for themselves was, let's see if I can say this, Ñañu, which is wild and definitely not accessible enough to be an actual civilization name, but so cool. They were also very heavily integrated into Nahua culture, so it's not really too out of place for them to have the name Otomi, even though it is an exonym. Last of our top contenders. This one I bet you haven't heard of before, the Guatemalan. Who the heck were they? Well, the Highland Mayas, contrasting the northern Yucatan Mayas. This civilization is primarily comprised of two very important and deeply interconnected Mayan ethnic groups, the Quiché and the Kaqchikel. These two had something of a symbiosis together and formed an incredibly robust and profoundly underrated civilization, which thrived through the classical era collapse, interconnected with Nahua neighbors, played politics with the north, and remained pretty much completely unconquered right up until the time of the Spanish. And they held on a long time against the Spanish as well, I should add. Because of that, I'm not really sure what they would have for an exact playstyle, but they gotta have a good late game because of how long they endured, and they must have fantastic economic endurance. The name Guatemalan is, again, a Nahua exonym, and it's also the root of the modern word Guatemala. I should note, though, that kind of like with the Otomi, Nahuatl was something of a lingua franca among the Mayan elite, so it's not really unprecedented, once again, that a Nahua word would be used for this civilization. You could also maybe make the argument to split the Quiché and the Kaqchikel into two civilizations, but they were really very conjoined, so you couldn't really have one without the other, and it would probably be kind of tough to distinguish them properly. And also, a fun fact, Kaqchikel translates to thieves of fire, which is the most badass thing I've ever heard. The only reason they are this far down the list is due to name recognition. In my heart, they would be a top contender by far. They deserve much more. And with that, we move on to the mid-contenders, the ones I don't think are likely to be added to the game, but I would still profoundly like to see and think absolutely deserve to be included, beginning with the Cuzcatlecs. Bet you haven't heard of them before. I sure as shit didn't either until I was introduced to them by AHMIQUI. These were the people of Cuzcatlan, which was a Nahua confederacy founded in what is now El Salvador, which retained many ties to the usual suspects of Mesoamerica and had a remarkably large and complex society that replicated but slightly changed a lot of elements that we would see in other Nahua powers like the Aztecs and Tlaxcaltecs. They even spoke a variant dialect of Nahuatl called simply Nahuatl, which I'm guessing was probably mutually intelligible but sounded very, very weird to normal Nahuatl speakers. They were a very powerful military state, and they had substantial influence in like all of post-classical Mesoamerica, though they were of course conquered by the Spanish alongside their Tlaxcaltec allies within about a decade of the fall of Tenochtitlan. In terms of their playstyle, this was one of the coolest civs out there. I was so happy AHMIQUI showed me it. They would be like a mid-game civilization, awesome variety, maybe have some like heavy armored phalanxes of long pikes, which they did use, but also this is the only documented siege engine maker in Mesoamerica. So if we're going to get a Meso siege civ, it's these guys. And that's probably how I would design them myself. For other notes, they are also often known as the Pipil, but the term Pipil is considered derogatory, kind of like Tarascan is considered derogatory for the Purepecha, so I would not use it. You could also even call them the Nahuatl, after like their language group. But this might be confusing, considering how close it is to the term Nahua or Nahuatl. It's also not commonly known that Mesoamerican civilizations spread way beyond Mexico, And so because of that, I think getting these guys in would be a huge boon to regional variety. They had like such a fantastically complex military structure, so we have tons of options for bonuses and unique units. And just how many of you knew that there was a profoundly impactful civilization in Mesoamerica and El Salvador? I didn't, and I think that many other players would love to learn that as well. So I think these guys should be top contenders. Another mid-contender, the Chichimeca. This is one I bet a lot of you have heard of before. Who were they? They were a non-Nahua Mesoamerican people. They were nomadic, reported to have ranged from like the Nahua lands around Tenochtitlan and all that, all the way up into the modern southeastern United States, like Arizona and New Mexico. Wow, that's a huge territory. And they were famed for their hit-and-run tactics, their lack of clothing, and being just all-around barbarians in the eyes of the Aztecs, who really didn't like dealing with them and considered them very unsavory and dangerous. And it turns out that their fears were well-founded, because when the Spanish came in, they had to fight a 40-year-long war against the Chichimeca, which the Chichimeca won, kind of, with some major concessions. But yeah, they actually fought off the Spanish, which is pretty freaking remarkable within the AoE2 timeframe. In terms of their playstyle, I would call them the steppe civilization of the Americas. Awesome hit and run, great speed, almost no armor or defenses, that sort of thing. I think it would be super duper fun to play as. And as I mentioned earlier, this was going to be a trend. Chichimeca is, say it again with me everyone, a Nahua exonym. Used kind of like the term barbarian was used by the Romans. It's not really clear what would be a better name, so I think Chichimeca works just fine. And they are probably related to some other Mesoamerican peoples like the Otomi, even though they are not Nahua as mentioned. Yet another great mid-contender, the Tayasal. Sick name, first of all. And so who were they? They were another Maya people. Specifically, Tayasal was the name for the capital and people of Petén Itzá, which was a state formed by some of the Itza peoples, evicted from the League of Mayapan in the 1100s. The Itza being one of the most prominent Maya ethnic groups. So at first, the people of Tayasal kept kind of a low profile, but they over time grew and grew and grew to rival the Highlanders to their south, mentioned earlier, and the Yucatecs to their north. And get this, they actually also managed to hold out against the Spanish, remaining completely unconquered during the AoE2 timeframe. They were unconquered until 1697! Holy shit, that's incredible! I mean, come on, what more of a pedigree do you need to be added to the game? So in terms of their playstyle, they should be a late game monster. They should have an incredible post-imperial, the best in Mesoamerica, but would be super vulnerable early to mid. They should be an arena clown's dream. Another name you could use could be Nohpeten, which I think is pretty cool, but Tayasal is about as accurate and just sounds so badass. You could even use the name Itzas for them, which I did consider at one point, but the Itzas spanned a very wide time frame, and this is trying to focus on a very specific period where Petén Itzá really became a major player. You could also call this like a time split of the Cholan civilization I mentioned earlier, similar to the Yucatecs. I've made it very clear over the years that I love time splitting civilizations, and I think it absolutely is something the game should be doing, and this is yet another example of this in practice. Though again, there are some major ethnic differences between these peoples as well that I think justifies it beyond mere time splitting. Now, from here we have one more mid-contender, another one you may have heard of before, the Huastecs. Who the heck were they? They were another Mayan people, but look at the map. They're way far away from traditional Mayan territories because they emigrated northwards along the western coast of the Gulf of Mexico sometime after the classical era collapsed. So they were one of the many refugee groups. They founded a pretty noteworthy bronze-making center and developed a very substantial military culture. They held their own against their Nahua neighbors and eventually were subjugated by the Aztecs, but remained mostly autonomous until the Spanish showed up as well. I think they would be like an early to mid-game civilization, maybe with like a mobile town center or like nomad mechanic to represent their like big migration. And they should have great early offenses and great rushes because they were ferocious warriors. Once again, Huastecs is a Nahua exonym. Their own name for themselves was Teinic, which is really cool, but again has almost no name recognition, which does matter to some degree. And like I said, Huastec warriors were seriously well respected, so much so that after the Aztecs conquered them, they created an entire new military caste called the Quechtecatl to honor and incorporate the Huastecs into their empire and give them their due. Like, good job guys, you put up a serious fight. They also had a strong art tradition, lots of body modifications, and had a very prominent role for women in their society, kind of like the Mixtecs, which I went over in my video on them. All in all, another fantastically interesting and unique civilization that totally deserves to be in the game, even if I'm not quite sure it will ever make it. But with that, we can move on to long shots, the stuff that I could see a lot of you guys thinking would be too much to include, but I would want to include in my ideal world, beginning with the Chontals. Who the heck were they? Well, they were yet another Maya people, living in what was previously the Olmec heartland. The Olmecs were well before the AoE2 timeframe today, so they will not be showing up in this presentation. So the Chontals thrived in the very early part of the AoE2 timeframe, 400 to like 600-ish AD, and also remained strong and prominent during the classical era up until like the 1000s AD. They founded some really major and prominent settlements, such as Kakashtla, which would be major trade hubs right up until the classical era collapsed, the reasons for which is still not known fully to this day. In terms of how the Chontals would play, I think they would be a very economy-focused civilization with a great early mid-game in particular, but then kind of have not much to do in post-imperial. Now, I'm sounding like a broken record here, but Chontal is a Nahua exonym. What a surprise. And it roughly translates to foreigner. The Chontals called themselves Yucatan, which is where we get the word Yucatan from today. Oh, I forgot, the Totonacs, another really, really interesting one that you might have heard of before. These were a Nahua-adjacent people in the southwestern Gulf Coast, and they were another major player within Mesoamerica since the pre-classical era, the days of Teotihuacan. In fact, in some sources, they are even claimed to have built Teotihuacan, though that is slightly dubious. They were eventually conquered by the Aztecs, but rebelled against them constantly, and were very successful in doing so, way more than a lot of the other Aztec vassal states. And they actually hold the distinction of being the first people encountered by Cortés. They fought alongside him, along with the Tlaxcaltecs, and remained firm allies of Spain. For playstyle, I think they would be a tenacious civilization with like a good early game and a ton of comeback potential in mid to late game, maybe even getting some gunpowder or cavalry if the history bears it out. So, kind of like mini Tlaxcaltecs with a very different overarching playstyle. So Totonac is, for once, not necessarily a Nahua exonym, but it might be. It is usually believed to be translated to 3 hearts, representing the 3 major cities of the Totonac people. Next up, the Pinomes. Who the heck were they? Well, you may notice that Western Mexico is looking awfully lonely, but that doesn't mean there was nothing happening there. The Pinomes were a non-Nahua people, likely the dominant ethnic group of the Western Mesoamerican state of Xalisco, which they would primarily represent in a civilization built in-game. They obviously had many smaller ethnic groups, which were like semi-interchangeable with a bunch of other prominent Western powers we'll discuss later, but that's kind of true for all of Mesoamerica and frankly all of history. It's impossible to divide it into these neat little boxes, so we're just going to throw our hands up and say that this is good enough. Xalisco, by the way, translates to Land of the Sandy Eye, which is sick. So the Pinomes were at one point ruled by a queen named Popoaltzin, during the time of the Spanish conquest, who clashed with the famously evil Nuno de Guzman, who I talk about in my Protopecha video. Link to that up here, by the way, if you want to go see it. He is truly one of history's great villains, and his exploits in Xalisco would be one of the major focal points of this civilization design. In terms of their overarching playstyle, I think you should probably do some sort of like combined arms style that incentivizes a lot of different unit types to be made to represent the many subject peoples that they had. So, like I said, this is a Western Mexican state, which were very important, fighting against like Eastern Nahua powers as well as the Purepecha, but sources on the Western powers are kind of scant. So even though we definitely want to have at least one Western civilization, and this is probably the best one, it would be kind of tough to research, especially in comparison to all the other civilizations that have thus far been featured in this presentation. And what a surprise, Pinomes is probably a Nahua exonym, meaning stranger. Thanks, Nahua exonyms. Very cool. Another long shot, the Tequache, another Western power, the dominant ethnic group of Tonalan. The Tequache were technically a Chichimeca people who like abandoned their nomadic way of life and founded like a permanent state and adopted sedentary lifestyles. They were often fighting with or collaborating with their other Western neighbors against their much stronger Eastern contemporaries, and the Tequache in particular were known for their ferocity and their skill as warriors. They were also part of a massive Western coalition that formed against the Spanish, rebelling against them for decades after their initial defeats. In terms of their playstyle, I think they would be another archer civilization like the Chichimecas, with some hit-and-run elements, but a far less drastic and polarizing playstyle, including much better armor and defenses. So a more classic archer civ, I think. You could also call the civilization Tonalan, like after their homeland, but Tequache is more accurate in terms of being an ethnic rather than a political designation. Now from here, you thought those were long shots. Now we come on to the mega long shots. Stuff that I would be, like, stunned if ever got close to being featured in a game. But they're still worth talking about, beginning with the Chorotegas. Who were they? You may notice on the map they are pretty far south, and that is because they are a people of what is now Costa Rica, quite probably emigrating to the region from the north as far back as Olmec times. They had a noteworthy state called the Kingdom of Nicoya. So if you've heard of Nicoya, that's these guys, which was a lesser-known pre-Columbian power, most famous for its jewelry, but also with a pretty robust military as well. They were quickly conquered by the Spanish when the Spanish reached the region, and for playstyles I don't really have any great ideas, but having a Costa Rican civilization is pretty freaking cool. I believe it would make them the single most southern Mesoamerican power in the game. Remember, Incas are not Mesoamerican. You could also call this civilization the Nicoya, which does have more name recognition, but is like not technically as accurate or ethnic of a designation. But if we're talking about other southern obscure Nahua adjacent powers, let's talk about the Lenca. Now, who are they? They were the foremost ethnic group of what is now Honduras. And they had a large federation of towns and tribes, usually along dialectical lines. They had a lot of interactions with the Nahua and Maya worlds, as well as their neighbors like the Cuscatlecs and the Chorotegas. But very notably, while not a unified people, they did have a pretty long war of resistance against the Spanish and fielded like a remarkably large force for being a decentralized people. So while they did not have like a unified state like the Nicoya, they are still worthy of mention as coming together to form something resembling a state when put under substantial pressure. I think they'd be another archer civilization, maybe with like a mid to late game focus to depict their rebellion. And if you haven't heard of the name Lenca before, you may have heard of them called the Lepawiran, the people of the jaguar, which is a pretty cool frickin' name. So as you can see, we're getting quite obscure here, but this is not as obscure as we go. From here, we finally move to the ultra mega long shots, the stuff that even I could maybe see not including. Beginning with the Chololtecs. Chololtec, that sounds familiar. Well, it should be familiar because these were the Nahua peoples of Cholula, one of the most important cities in all of Mesoamerica and the single longest inhabited settlement in Mexico. In history. Super cool. Cholula was extraordinarily important. It was an economic hub, it was a religious hub, and it lasted and endured for many, many centuries, heavily influencing the culture of Mesoamerica. It was not called Cholula back in the day, it was called Chololan, hence the reference to Tolan Chololan that I mentioned earlier. For playstyle, this would have to be some sort of economic monster, maybe with a monk sub-theme. So Cholula is very important, but its history is kind of surprisingly obscure and hard to separate from its neighbors. Hence why this is an ultra mega long shot and not higher up on the list. You could easily fold this one into several of the other civilizations I proposed earlier, like the Toltecs would be probably my top contender, but I still think it's important enough to maybe stand out on some. Just maybe. Hence, ultra mega long shot. Also, notice how this name sounds a lot like Chorotegas? Well, that's because the Chorotegas probably originated here in the pre-classical era and then fled south to Costa Rica before the AoE2 timeframe even started. In fact, Chololan, aka Cholula, was sometimes referred to or translated as the place of those who fled, which I think is really, really interesting and shows just how important the migration of the Chorotegas was to the history and lore surrounding this city. That said, just as a reminder, the post-classical inhabitants of Cholula were pretty much universally Nahua. The Chorotegas were like an earlier break-off. And for the last civilization on the list, we come to another obscure Western power, the Tecos. They were the dominant ethnic group of Coliman, which was another prominent Western state, most famous for fighting the Saltpeter War alongside the Pino mentioned earlier against the Purepecha in the late 1400s, which was a very important piece of history. They did also have an extremely famous cultural hero called Colimotl, who fought, I believe, in this war and a little bit afterwards as well, who would be an obvious shoo-in for a campaign. But unfortunately, that's kind of where our knowledge about the Tecos stop. They are very hard to research, and as such, I have no idea for their playstyle. It would be nice to have them because they were really important in this one big war, which was an important war. But in terms of overall Mesoamerican powers, I would personally rank them the least important. Though, if I had my way and I had the sources, I would still obviously love to include them. But with that, we move on to regional units. We've gone over our civilizations, but there's plenty more I would love to add, or at least consider adding, such as The ball game court, the iconic Mesoamerican sport, which was played in some form across almost all the civilizations I've mentioned today. It's not really clear to me how we should, make this thing work. It is cool, though, and iconic, and I'd love to have it featured. Just not sure how to do so yet. Besides that, we have chakmuls, offering bowls outside of temples. This would be a monastery tech that maybe let you drop resources at a monastery for bonus returns. The AHMIQUI, which was like a sacrificing priest. Maybe it could, grant nearby allies benefits whenever it killed an enemy. This is kind of pop history-ish, but there is some evidence of mid-battle sacrifices performed by military priests. Then the tipostipili, which was an obsidian spear, kind of like a majoito, but with a very long haft. I think it could be cool as a replacement for the halberdier and pikeman line, but with some other slight variation to what it does to make it stand out. The tlashimontepostli is a more obscure sort of soldier, a bronze axeman that was used widely across Mesoamerica and often featured in art and iconography. I'm just not really sure about the effect on this one. And lastly, the Tlatoani, which was a Nahua-style ruler, a strong aura unit to the general of an army, the supreme commander and executive, but maybe you can only have one at a time. So these regionals are roughly arranged by how likely and important I think they would be to include. And I think if nothing else, the ball game court, chakmuls, and the AHMIQUI are all absolute shoo-ins. Beyond these, though, I would love to see some more Maya stuff in general. I don't know enough about the Maya to propose all that much yet, but once I eventually get to the sources, I'm going to be looking for options, and I might have to update this list at some point. If you've been following the channel for a while, you'll notice that most of these ideas have featured in videos in the past, such as the Protopecha and Mishtax. Though I have updated a couple of my views since then and added stuff like the Tlatoani. And with all that, we finally come to the end of this massive Mesoamerican mess. Tell me what you think, guys. I want to hear from you guys. Did I miss anything? Are there any regionals that you would suggest adding on top of the ones that I mentioned? And how far would you personally take this split? Of all the civilizations I mentioned in this video, the 17 on the slides and the 3 that I've already done on this channel, what would you like to see included in the game? Enormous thanks once again to AHMIQUI. Without him, this presentation would not have been possible. He did brilliant work. Please give him your thanks down in the comments section. And lastly, I would love to hear from you guys down in the comments section. What region should I add to, or what civilization should I split next on this mini-series here on the channel? But until then, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.